Okay, here's where we catch a real break from the College Board. With the old curriculum, I had to cover a dizzying array of modernist architecture because lots of modernist buildings had shown up on the AP exam in the past. With the revised curriculum, we only need to cover 4 buildings. But of course, this also means that we might miss some real treats along the way, and I can't let that happen, can I? So, the image on the left is a stairwell designed by Belgian Art Nouveau architect Victor Horta. It is paired with Gaudi's famously weird apartment building, the Casa Mila, lower right, and Gaudi's wonderful and wild cathedral, upper right. Both Horta and Gaudi are associated with the Art Nouveau and earlier arts and crafts schools. These architects wanted buildings and their interiors to be works of art, harkening back to the great craftsmanship of the Middle Ages. Do you remember Gothic revival? Like the architects of the Houses of Parliament, these architects did not reject modern materials, in this case iron and concrete. Yes, the Romans had used concrete, but it only re-emerged as a major architectural element in the late 19th century when architects started reinforcing concrete with iron and then steel. These structures were likewise designed to capture organic elements from nature. Horta created twining plant designs. Gaudi employed curves, a natural shape in nature, and really tried to create a building that looked as if it had grown from the soil. The architects of the Eiffel Tower, by contrast, made no effort to recapture the past or to imitate nature. This is a monument to modernity, created for the 1889 World's Fair to showcase France's industrial leadership and the new building materials that allowed buildings to soar skyward. It did not make the list. But arguably the most important contribution of new building technology, in particular the use of iron or steel reinforced concrete, steel I-beams, and the invention of the elevator, was that these innovations made skyscrapers possible. This building isn't on the list, although another work by the same architect is, and we'll get there in a moment. The Prudential Building is considered to be the first masterpiece of early skyscraper architecture. Rather than disguising the building's inevitable verticality, Sullivan chose to emphasize its height with narrow columns of windows that draw the eye upward. But note that Sullivan's skyscrapers were not just rectangular boxes stood on end. He added elegant ornamentation as well. So here's Sullivan's own description of what he was trying to do. Quote, "The tall office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, rising in sheer exultation from the bottom to the top as a unit without a single dissenting line." Sullivan felt that a building's interior function should direct its exterior form, and he coined the now famous phrase, "form follows function." Actually, let me share the entire quote, and I think it's quite poetic. "Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law." And finally, here's our first recorded work of modernist architecture, another Louis Sullivan skyscraper. And now you see why I took the time to talk about Art Nouveau decoration. Note the elaborate ironwork on the entry level and the curve that sweeps around the corner, giving an organic feel to an otherwise modernist geometric structure. Here's a photo of the building under construction, which reveals the steel frame. And by the way, Sullivan cased the steel in terracotta piping, which increased its fire resistance. Indeed, Louis Sullivan's architecture is also known as the Chicago School as well as the Skyscraper School, not only because he worked in Chicago, but also because his architectural innovations grew out of lessons learned from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Huge swaths of downtown Chicago had burned and needed to be rebuilt, and architects like Sullivan sought to create designs that met the needs of modern commerce and provided better fire protection. The building is remarkable for its steel frame structure, which allowed a dramatic increase in window area. The large plate glass windows gave pedestrians a glimpse at the merchandise and lured them in from the streets. Note that the entrance on an oblique or corner angle This way can be seen from both intersecting streets. The cylindrical corner tower emphasizes the building's verticality, an important theme of Sullivan and the Bauhaus and international style architects that we'll see in a few minutes who followed him. Add verticality to your art history vocabulary, okay? But notice that the building also includes Art Nouveau style iron decoration. Sullivan worked before the international style gained ascendancy, and he never shared their rejection of ornamentation. I've said that Sullivan believed form should follow function. Notice how steel allowed for thin internal columns and big open spaces, again appropriate for a department store. So here's a vintage photograph of the second floor and the department store's elegant dining space. An important element of Sullivan's skyscraper architecture was a tripartite structure, a lower level that accommodated the function of a commercial building with spaces that would attract customers, a middle layer of identical, highly symmetrical, highly vertical office floors, and finally, an attic story that was usually set apart with a decorative cornice, at least in Sullivan's designs. Both Sullivan and Mies van der Rohe, who's the architect of the last work we'll see today, were fascinated by what they saw as the ideal forms of Greek temple architecture. Note how the tripartite structure, which van der Rohe's Seagram Building will share, echoes the three parts of a Greek column. Louis Sullivan's most famous apprentice was Frank Lloyd Wright, who was also a Chicago architect, and the most important proponent of what is known as the Pirie School. Wright was influenced not only by Sullivan, but also by low-slung Japanese architecture. Nevertheless, he was attempting to come up with an authentically American style. The interior plan of the Roby House was highly innovative. Victorian homes, and that's what surrounded the Roby House, tended to be broken into individual rooms, each with a very specific purpose and closed off from each other. Wright's open plan design centered around a hearth and encouraged multiple uses of the rooms and lots of intermingling. This famous building also used to show up in the AP test all the time. It is off the list, and frankly, I do not miss it. I find the Bauhaus headquarters boxy and boring. But I really can't skip this episode in architectural history, since Bauhaus set the stage for all of the architects we will examine today. The Bauhaus School was founded in Weimar, Germany after World War I by Walter Gropius and continued by Mies van der Rohe, who is, again, one of our required architects. It laid the groundwork for what came to be known as international style. These were the form follows function guys. They were enamored of modern construction materials and technology. They loved simple, clean lines without architectural ornamentation, and they focused strongly on excellence in craftsmanship. So let's watch a clip from Art of the Western World, which will also give us a tour of our next required work, the Villa Savoye, and the work after that, Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater. I will warn you in advance, the art historian who leads us through these works will not win any Academy Awards for acting. Talk about stiff. But the explanations and the visuals are really helpful. Pay attention, by the way, to the furniture in the Villa Savoye, as well as to the building itself. It helps capture the design aesthetic of a Bauhaus and subsequent international style. The Villa Savoye is an international style house built by Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. The villa is probably his best-known building from the 1930s, and it had enormous influence on the emergence of international style. The home employed Le Corbusier's 5 points, which you learned about in your homework, and which I'm going to review now. Point 1. Ground-level supporting beams elevate the building from the earth, creating a better view and the sensation that the house is somehow floating on the landscape. This also allows the garden to extend beyond the house. There's a functional roof that serves as a garden and a terrace. This reclaims for nature the land occupied by the building. I just note that even Le Corbusier encountered the curse of flat roofs. They don't drain easily, so they leak. His leaked. 3, we have an open floor plan. The elimination of load-bearing walls, replaced by load-bearing narrow pillars, allowed Le Corbusier, sorry, I struggle with that pronunciation, to place walls only where they seemed aesthetically necessary. Frank Lloyd Wright, we'll see, used this technique as well. 4, there are long horizontal ribbon windows that provide illumination and also ventilation. Again, this feature shows up in Prairie-style architecture. Finally, there are flat, geometric, unornamented facades that really serve only as a skin for the wall and windows. Le Corbusier was able to carefully design all four sides of the Villa Savoye to accommodate the view and the orientation of the sun. In other words, he viewed this home as a machine for living, to use his famous phrase. Like other architects of the Bauhaus/International style, Le Corbusier was interested in exploring the potential of new materials, so this building is made mostly of reinforced concrete. Moving on to our next required work, what does this building have in common with the Villa Savoye? Well, it too is integrated very closely with its surroundings, which to my mind are a whole lot more interesting. In the past, I've warned students that the College Board always seems to ask the same questions about Frank Lloyd Wright. And the answer is that he sought to establish an organic relationship between structure and site. Most brilliant, although ultimately somewhat problematic, was his decision to build over the waterfall and the stream, not just to situate the house where they could be easily viewed. But you should also know that Wright's focus on the hearth as the center of the home and his open plan architecture also kind of echo the Villa Savoye. The hearth is more of a Wright tradition, and he ties that to the Midwestern style that influenced him. Another Wright theme beloved of the College Board is the use of cantilevering. Those balconies extending out over the water are cantilevered. That is, they are attached to the building at just one end, although they are somewhat supported by pillars. Unfortunately, Wright's design was not as architecturally sound as it was architecturally interesting. It cost $155,000, admittedly, in 1939 dollars to build the house in 1939 and $11.5 million to restore it in 1994. The balconies were sagging and they had to be lifted back in place with steel cables. You may not have time to watch this, but this link takes you to a very interesting short video that uses computer graphics to show how this house was constructed and designed to tie into its natural environment. We have two international-style buildings in our list of required works, the Villa Savoye, which we've just seen, and the Seagram Building, which was constructed more than 25 years later. So here's a question that appeared on a past AP exam from the old curriculum. I've already talked about technological innovations such as the I-beam steel frame, elevators, and steel-enforced concrete. Another important technological feature of these skyscrapers is floors that cantilever from an interior frame. Since these buildings do not need thick supporting outer walls, architects can design window or curtain walls that are hung from the floor above and open the building to light. The highly geometric forms show the influence of Mondrian and de Stijl, as well as Cubism. The less is more philosophy, that's a famous quote from Van der Rohe, is reflected in the austere lines and the simple geometric contours of the building. The Khan Academy talked about reasons for setting it back from the street, but it did not add that the New York City setback laws required architects to terrace their structures back from the curb to allow sunlight to penetrate to the street. City zoning authorities had grown increasingly worried that New York was becoming a city of urban canyons. The plaza in front of the building integrates it to the surroundings, a real theme of this lecture, and it creates a welcome open space in a crowded urban environment. In general, international-style architects were very concerned about providing light, hence all the windows. Note, too, that while this building has the usual spare or unornamented design typical of international style, the architects have used bronze as an accent. That's part of what keeps the building from being boring and part of what it made it extraordinarily expensive to construct. And you'll remember to use the word verticality if you get this kind of question, right? One final note. Since I last recorded lectures on modern architecture, Khan Academy has updated its articles and lectures on the subject. One theme that emerged, and I didn't talk about in earlier versions of this lecture, is the strong influence that classical architecture had on Louis Sullivan, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. Continuity and change over time, a very popular College Board theme. You've already seen how the tripartite skyscraper structure echoed the tripartite Greek column. Mies van der Rohe made direct comparisons between the essential forms embodied in modern cars and in Greek temples. Here's a page from his 1923 book, Toward an Architecture. Mies van der Rohe also adopted a tripart structure for the Seagram Building, as Sullivan did with the Carson Pirie Scott Building. The architectural historian who's interviewed in the Khan Academy video on the Seagram Building likewise notes other ways in which classical tradition influenced Mies van der Rohe. There's his use of bronze, there's the classical symmetry, there's the way the striated or striped lines of the rectangular columns seem to echo fluted columns in Greek temples. And finally, there's the presence of a platform that likewise might echo the Greek temple stylobate or a temple platform. That's not a connection I'd explored before. These tall, sleek, modern buildings seem so far removed from Greek temples, but I found the link to classical architecture to be both fascinating and persuasive. And these architects used these comparisons very deliberately. They were well aware of classical architecture. Do you remember that I've warned in the past that AP students tend to score lower on architecture questions? These modernist works show up all the time on the AP exam, including the current curriculum, questions from the current curriculum, so you need to know them.